นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังคุนุตรังอุปัชฌายังนะมาสามิ When I was first studying Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, somewhat puzzled and even put off by the fact that the teachings tended to be expressed in terms of groups, numbered groups, 4 Dhammas, 5 Dhammas, 6 Dhammas, and so on. I assumed that the reason for that form was to enable easy memorization of the teachings, and I think that is certainly one of the reasons for it. But another important reason which became more and more apparent as I started to practice the teachings was that Dhammas do not exist in a vacuum, that we can't just take individual Dhamma teachings out of the context in which the Buddha presented them and still expect them to provide the results that we expect or hope for. A good example of this is the teaching on contentment. In Thailand, there was a period when the economic development started to accelerate, and it was felt that it was actually proposed that Buddhist monks should not teach contentment, as it would be an obstacle. It would retard economic development. People would be so content that they wouldn't want to do anything. They just sit around and be lazy. The sad thing about that misunderstanding of the Buddha's teachings is that the Buddha went to some pains to prevent that very misconception. If you look up in any of the groups of Dhammas in which santuti or contentment appears, it's always accompanied by a teaching such as effort or non-laziness, diligence, and so on. So looking at the teachings in their context is extremely important. And another good example are the 4 Brahma Viharas of Metta, Karuna, Mudita, Upekkha. And in most of these groups we find that there is a representative of the wisdom faculty. It's not always called Panya or wisdom in the 4 Itipadas, the factors of success. It's called Vimamsa. It's a particular aspect of wisdom. In the 4 Brahmaviharas, Upekkha is the wisdom faculty, and it's the wisdom understanding that arises from reflecting on the law of karma. So without that, if we develop metta, loving kindness, or compassion, or even sympathetic joy, then we can often suffer as a result if we wish for someone to be happy, or we see someone suffering and we want to help them and to relieve their suffering, but we're unable to do so. Then we may very easily become sad, discouraged, upset. Now, if that's the case, then our practice has deviated from the middle way, and we've not grasped the teachings correctly. And so with upekkha, we recognize that the causes and conditions for that person's suffering are such that they are not yet in a position or in a mental state in which they can receive help, or perhaps our relationship with that person is not such at the present moment as will permit us to relieve their suffering in any way. So what do? Well, we retreat into upekkha, and upekkha is perhaps comparable to the neutral gear in a car. So it's not indifference or turning one's back on someone who's unwilling to accept our help and our kindness, but it's a willingness to rest in the mind which is ready to shift into a more active mode whenever it might be appropriate, but is content to be in a more passive mode until the time is right. So equanimity is the evenness of mind which is accompanied by a readiness to act in the most appropriate and effective way whenever that opportunity should arise. So in approaching the Dhamma, study of the teachings, memorization of the teachings is very important because it gives us an immediate access to the Buddha's words and to the organic nature of the teachings. In terms of our life as monastics, this same kind of principle applies to our vinaya and our sila. If we an analogy that I would suggest for monastic precepts and observances is of a concentric rings of defenses against an enemy, like a fort with 7 concentric walls. Now, if the defenders of the fort can successfully defend the outer perimeter, then it's not necessary to worry about the inner fortifications or the treasures in the heart of the fort, and the minor rules and regulations and observances form this outer perimeter. So if we take individual observances out of their overall context, sometimes they can seem pointless, even comical. I remember one lay visitor at Wat Nanachat sitting in on Vinaya instruction and saying it sounded to him like Monty Python. And if you look at particular observances, like one by one, then they can seem rather trivial, nitpicking, unnecessarily fussy. But when they are seen in the overall context and in their role as the outer perimeter of our sila, then they are seen in quite a different light. Ajahn Chah famously said, "You look after your precepts and your precepts look after you." And in the Vinaya texts themselves, I can remember as a young monk reading the English translations. There was a time when Ajahn Jayasaro and I were helping to work on a book of Vinaya commentary, and we did a lot of study in those days. And the pattern, recurring pattern in the events leading up to the laying down of Vinaya rules includes a section in which monks act badly, and then another group called the modest monks inform the Buddha. And although have very obviously very committed to the Vinaya, there's some kind of old sanya that rebels against being sort of included in the modest monks. And there's something about that phrase that didn't really quite click, seemed like sort of the goody monks, or the sort of the killjoy monks. And so I looked up the Thai translation, and there I found that the Thai translation was monks who have seen bentirak, which means who are devoted to Sila, who have an affection, have a love, have a devotion for their Sila, were the ones who informed the Buddha. And that translation pleased me very much. In the Visuddhimagga, when Venerable Buddhaghosa is discussing the Dhammas, the virtues, which are fundamental or essential to the practice of the different kinds of parisuddhi sila, the 4 kinds of parisuddhi sila. In the case of the Patimokkha Sangvara sila, the virtue which is considered most important is faith, or sattha. So with the Dhamma, the Dhamma, as you know, is something which invites us to investigate, invites us to put it to the test. It stands up to analysis. It stands up to rigorous analysis. But the Vinaya does not in the same way. And the results of keeping minor rules, regulations, monastic observances is perhaps not so easily recognized in one's life as the practice of meditation. But over the course of years, then one really does recognize the value of these rules, regulations, observances. If one takes on with faith the whole package, not just the letter but the spirit, then one sees very clearly that giving importance even to the minor rules means that the major rules become almost taboos, and the one just the very notion of breaking one of the more serious rules becomes almost absent from the mind, because the intention to break even the lighter and less weighty rules is given so much importance. I was reminded of this some years ago in reading Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, in which he refers to the broken window theory, and in which he explains that the changes, the positive changes made in New York City in, I guess, in the late 80s or whenever, started off when they spent a lot of time and effort on cleaning up the subway trains and stopping people from traveling on them without tickets. The moment a subway train was sprayed with graffiti, it was taken into shed and sprayed. And the idea behind it, and seemed to be justified, was that if you live in an environment where anything goes, and that even the trains can't be kept clean, and anybody who wants to ride without a ticket does so, then the standard for what is allowable becomes very low. But when the authorities gave so much importance to even the slightest amount of graffiti on the trains, then people realized that a higher standard of behavior was expected. There's kind of interesting aside, really, digression maybe. I was reading recently about a national park in America. This national park is famous for various rocks, boulders, which have some kind of mineral in them. And I've never been to this place, but apparently they're very beautiful, rocky landscape. They found that a huge number of these small rocks and boulders were being stolen by visitors every year. And they put their heads together in the national park as to how to deal with this problem. And they ended up putting up a number of signs saying this national park is the heritage of all Americans, and it's here for us and for future generations. Unfortunately, a huge number of rocks are stolen every year. Please respect this national park and preserve it for future generations, something like that. After this these signs had been put up, the effect was that the number of rocks and boulders and stones that were stolen increased quite a lot. Didn't decrease, increased. So why should that be? Well, people who read the signs gathered from it that many people every year steal small rocks and boulders as souvenirs, so why shouldn't they? Just one more person in a huge number. So they changed the signs, subtly, but very effectively. This is national park, it's a heritage of all Americans, and so on and so forth. The vast majority of visitors to this park respect the park and do not take any of the rocks away as souvenirs. Unfortunately, there is a small minority that do steal from, and please respect. So now when people saw this sign, they didn't want to be part of the small minority who sort of, so gross and disrespectful that they would take rocks away. So we're very, very sensitive to this, and what the standard of what is allowable does, and what is acceptable by the majority has a lot of weight on our minds. And so when we voluntarily create certain standards of Sila, and we all help to maintain those standards, then Sila becomes very easy, and we can create and maintain a very high standard of conduct. So, looking at Sila, there's, I think, one or two important observations I'd like to make about this. One is that Sila itself cannot be treated separately from Samadhi and Panya. And in the threefold training or education that the Buddha laid down for us, in Sila, Samadhi and Panya are present as supporting factors. In the practice of Samadhi, Sila and Panya are present as supporting factors. In the practice of Panya, Sila and Samadhi are present as supporting factors. So it's merely that one of those three is the salient feature at any particular moment, but it cannot be separated from the two other areas or stages of the practice. So in theistic traditions, then the idea is usually of a deity or an absolute being, creator, who lays down certain rules. And the moral system, the moral code, tends to be one founded upon reward and punishment. This is right, you should do this. If you do it, you'll be rewarded. This is wrong, it's bad. If you do it, you'll be punished. And in Buddhism, of course, we don't ascribe to that idea of an ultimate external supernatural force. Don't accept that hypothesis. So in our religious tradition, we consider Sila to be basically common sense, that we look on the kind of community, society, the kind of world that we would like to live in. What are the features of a pleasant and fulfilling kind of environment? And I think the kind of features that we may consider universal are that we would like to live in a place in which we feel safe, and in which we feel a sense of trust, one in which we feel warmth and kindness and support. So if we can agree on those kinds of abstract principles, the next step is, well, practically speaking, how do you go about creating that kind of family, that kind of community, that kind of monastery, that kind of society? And the Buddha tells us that we need to make use of a unique human capacity. That is the capacity to refrain from certain actions and certain ways of speaking. So there's this important recognition that willpower and volition are important tools to be used in spiritual life and in our social life, but that they are limited. So we can not, for instance, make a decision or bow in front of the Buddha and make a vow that from this day onwards I'm never going to get angry with anybody anymore. Anger's bad, and I don't want to be a bad person. I'm not going to be angry anymore. It's just not possible to do that. Volition doesn't have that kind of scope. But it is practical, reasonable, intelligent to make a firm vow or volition not to kill, not to harm, not to inflict pain on others. That is a completely realistic goal and standard for life in society for anyone. So we're seeing that as human beings, we have instincts. We are animals. We have animal instincts. That's not bad. But we also have the freedom or the capacity to experience the freedom from instincts. So we to get angry when we are fearful or when we are frustrated, when we don't get what we want, when things aren't the way we like them to be, then that's quite natural certainly for an untrained mind. But the action and speech based upon or issuing from that anger is something that we can do something about very easily, very directly. So the Buddha said that we have an idea, we have a goal of the kind of society that we would like to live in. We recognize that that kind of society can be created when we restrain our actions and speech within boundaries which we accept voluntarily. So the aspect of to voluntarily take upon certain boundaries of action and speech is essential to Buddhist morality. So if, for instance, one was to refrain from killing and stealing and sexual misconduct and so on, merely out of a fear of punishment or of fear that one's people around one would look at you with contempt or dislike or reject you, then that from an external and superficial appearance, that person would be keeping the 5 precepts and would be pure in Sila. But in terms of the threefold training, Sila has not yet arisen, because the mental state behind the refraining from certain actions and speech is not one which will lead on to samadhi. If we voluntarily take precepts or boundaries upon us, then being able to restrain and to manage our actions and speech successfully gives rise to self-confidence and self-esteem. And when we realize that even in environments which are not at all conducive to virtuous behavior, we are able to maintain our standards, it gives rise to a sense of stability. Now, in your own meditation, I wonder if you really observed to what extent the disruptive, distracting thoughts that arise and function as obstacles in practice tend to be concerned with matters of Sila, things that we've done, things that we've said, things that we feel we didn't do but should have done, things that we didn't say and should have said, things that others have done or not done, said or not said. How much of the noise and distraction in our meditation is bound up with unskillful action and speech. This is why the anisong, the positive result of Sila, which we should aim for, is the reduction and an elimination of guilt and remorse. So if keeping precepts makes you very uptight or increases guilt and remorse, or then there is something off balance with our Sila. Now, another very important teaching on this subject was given by the Buddha in one of his expositions of the nature of the sage and the fool. And the Buddha says that if a monk or a nun was to have pure Sila, to keep precepts in a very impeccable way, but as a result would look down upon others who are unable to keep the same impeccable standard, then that person would be considered a fool and not a sage. Indeed, he goes on to various other practices, even to the attainment of jhana and so on, that as a basis of this progress or attainment in practice, if as a result of it one starts to look down on others as being inferior to oneself, at that moment one becomes a fool and not a sage. Sila is in itself an important meditation practice. It's not what provides the foundation for meditation alone. The reason for this is that mindfulness, sati, is not a wisdom factor. It's a samadhi factor, and it is basically the non-forgetting of in meditation object, or in daily life. It means not forgetting anything which you need to remember in any situation. It means you're mindful. But mindfulness is, or sati, is a factor which always requires an object. It's not like this sort of floating, nebulous, awareness. You always have to be aware of something. And one of the reasons why mindfulness in daily life is so much more difficult to sustain is because we lose sight of the object of mindfulness. Now, it's not possible to be mindful of the breath throughout the whole day. If you're answering the phone or you have a very busy life, then, or even as monastics with so many different responsibilities, the skill, the life skills that we're trying to develop is to be able to switch between different objects of mindfulness and being able to recognize in different situations what is the most appropriate object of mindfulness. Now, in our daily life, then the most immediate and effective object of mindfulness in daily life is precepts. So, if you're in a situation, in a meeting, for instance, what are you mindful of? Well, you can be mindful of your feelings and emotions and so on. But what really grounds you is you're being mindful of the factors of right speech, not to tell lies, not to exaggerate, not to omit information that should be provided, not to gloss over things that we find embarrassing when they do need to be. It doesn't always, you don't have to go into full confessional mode about everything that's going on, but when something should be revealed, then one is humble about revealing it. And the practice of mindfulness of speech and mindfulness of precepts can be expanded. And I think a very useful teaching was given by the Buddha in relation to what he calls supasita, or good, noble speech. That is characterized by 5 factors: speech which is true and useful and timely and kind and polite. But the Buddha says, in reality, there are 10 kinds of speech that you will meet in life. You will meet speech which is true, untrue, useful, useless, timely, not timely, kindly meant, unkindly meant, polite and impolite. So for your own speech, the mindfulness is to be speaking, is this correct? Is it true? Is it true, but is it useful? Is it the right time and place to say this? What's my intention? Am I speaking with kindness? Am I speaking politely? And when listening to someone speaking, then there's also that kind of analysis going on in the background. Initially, of course, if you've never done it, it can seem very artificial and you can't keep up with it very well. But if you do it enough, you become more proficient. Is this true or untrue? Useful, useless, timely, untimely, kindly meant, unkindly meant, polite or impolite? And by being able to just pull that apart in that way, you have a more nuanced and subtle appreciation of the speech of others. For instance, someone may say something which is true and very useful, but one rejects it because of the tone of voice, or it might be very sort of harshly or crudely expressed. But with this kind of mindfulness, you can separate those two. That's a factor. Yes, this is rather aggressive, disrespectful, crude kind of speech, but it's probably the right time. It needs to be said right now. This is a good time to talk about this, and it is useful, and what he's saying is probably true. So having these kind of factors in your mind, they are objects of recollection. So I feel this is a really important point which is often overlooked. The precepts and the monastic observances provide an incredibly sophisticated web of objects of recollection in our daily life, and enable us to be maintaining a steady stream of mindfulness. So mindfulness, as the Buddha said, is like this is one of the very few of the Buddha's similes which is probably people would argue with these days, because the Buddha said, just as salt is essential to every curry, so mindfulness is essential to every situation. But now salt has been demonized rather as not essential and actually harmful in many dishes. But I think we get the general idea of it. It's essential in every situation, just as the Prime Minister needs to have a knowledge of all of the ministries under his governance, then similarly mindfulness has to be there all the time. But although there's a steady quality of mindfulness required, the object of mindfulness has to be constantly adjusted. So I think when we see this, we see that keeping precepts is a Dhamma practice. Keeping precepts is a practice of mindfulness. Keeping precepts creates a foundation of self-esteem, self-respect, confidence, and a light and bright mind, which are all factors which are essential for the more subtle levels of mental development. So in our another point I'd like to make here by the by is that in the threefold training of Sila, Samadhi and Panya, the word Samadhi in this context does not refer to concentration or stability of mind. But here Samadhi the word Samadhi is fulfilling the function of the most prominent, the most essential, or the leader of the practices in this area of stage of training. In fact, Samadhi refers to the whole range of practices aimed at gradually reducing the unwholesome dhammas in the heart and creating and sustaining and bringing to maturation all the positive qualities. So the practice of patience and effort and kindness, these are all part of the training in the samadhi stage of the practice. So again, if you are in a situation in which it's not very peaceful and it's rather unpleasant, then you can always find a Dhamma practice and one within the samadhi stage to develop at that time. Patient endurance is the obvious example. Even in the monastic circles, I think we can often look at patient endurance in a somewhat patronizing way. It's like the consolation prize, well, I didn't really get very much out of this or that, but I suppose I got some patient endurance out of it. It's like it's well, better than nothing. I developed some patience, which is a rather strange attitude to have when we bear in mind that the seminal teaching given by the Buddha in the first year of his dispensation, in which he was laying down the most important principles of Dhamma for the first generation of arahants to propagate throughout India. And the Buddha says, what's the highest goal? Nibbana. What's the most effective practice? Patient endurance. The supreme eliminator or exterminator or crematorium of defilement. It's patient endurance. So how is it that we give it so little importance? Or as I say, if we do recognize, particularly those of us who live with Luang Por Chah, that it is very important, and yet the heart doesn't kind of rise up. You just feel, well, yes, I've developed some patient endurance and feel a lot of joy in that. But if we reflect on the Buddha's teaching, then it is a wonderful thing to develop, not a small thing at all. And I've of all Lumpur Sumedho's wonderful teachings over the years, I think one that's stuck with me and that I've appreciated as much as any is his definition of Khanti, of patient endurance, as peaceful coexistence with the unpleasant. That idea of patient endurance, not be sort of gritting your teeth and just sort of getting through this, but that sense of peaceful coexistence with the things that we don't like, the things that we wish were some other way. So I think as monastics, we do have this wonderful opportunity, and it's easy to take things for granted, of course, and myself, last few years, I'm now in Thailand, I'm usually introduced to, when I give talks, as the ex-abbot of Wat Nanachat. So I don't have a title anymore, so I'm an ex-abbot, but I live most of the year by myself, not living in community. And but sometimes when I speak with young monks, they get frustrated and fed up living in community, and they feel that the answer to their problems would be to live like me, to live alone. And the thing that I tend to say to people is, if you live in a community and you're always arguing with other people, if you go and live by yourself, you'll end up arguing with yourself. That the person who can make a real go of living in solitude and enjoy it and derive benefit from it is someone who can live in harmony with other human beings. So I left the monastery and went to live in solitude after I'd proved to myself, I'm not completely successful by any means, but that I generally enjoyed living with other monastics and got on with them reasonably well most of the time. But that solitude is not an escape from unskillful relations with friends and colleagues and brothers and sisters. And it's quite the opposite. That if you have difficulties with other monks and nuns, then there are hindrances in the mind. There's always something coming from inside you and grasping onto and adding onto the stimulus from outside. This is so if you look at the five khandhas, Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara, Vijnana, Rupa, Vedana, Sanya, Vijnana, these are vipaka, these are vipaka, these are results of karma in the past. But the sankhara khandha is the karma creating khandha in the present. And we can see that for suffering to arise in the human mind, there always has to be some ingredient, something within us adding on to, grasping onto situations. And this is where we see the opportunity for freedom. We see that there's nothing that happens in the world, no situation, absolutely nothing, nobody that can force us to suffer if we are sufficiently developed in Sila, Samadhi, Panya. So that's quite a breathtaking idea, I think, and it goes against the way that we tend to think about life and articulate our experience to ourselves. So often somebody will say, "He really made me angry," or "She's really annoying." There's this idea that there's this kind of inevitability about the reaction that we have to events and to people. In fact, that's not the case. Even in our own minds, we can see that our reactions to things are not fixed and stable, that a certain kind of behavior in one person may not annoy us in any way at all, whereas in someone else we might find it intolerable. Similarly, we may find one day we're in a very good mood for some reason and something happens and we can just let it go. On another occasion, we're in a bad mood and it's an absolute crisis. So this observation of change and variation and the degrees of emotional reaction are proofs that there is no fixed and inevitable result of events and impingement on the sense bases. So we can take responsibility for this more and more and seek to protect our minds, protect our minds with Sila, Samadhi, and Panya. On one occasion, the Buddha characterized teachings in 3 terms. He says this sasana, this Dhamma Vinaya, is a teaching of Kamma Vada, Viriya Vada, Vipajja Vada. So these are 3 terms very important. It's a teaching of Kamma. It's a teaching that actions, volitional actions, are meaningful and have results which are consonant with those actions. And most simply, as we say, is that if you do good, good results, bad results. The second, Viriyavada, means that effort is meaningful. Effort is required. What are the efforts? The effort to protect the mind from unwholesome dhammas that have not yet arisen, the effort to eliminate unwholesome dhammas that do manage to arise, the effort to create wholesome dhammas that have not yet arisen, and to care for and to nurture and to bring to maturation those wholesome dhammas that have arisen. So the Buddha says, you can do this. Monks, I tell you to abandon the unwholesome and develop the wholesome because it is something that you can do. If it wasn't possible, if it was unrealistic, the Tathagata wouldn't tell you to do this. So virya and effort is possible and should be expended. the third quality of vipajjavada. Vipajja means analysis. So the wisdom faculty is developed when the mind is sufficiently calm, free of hindrances, when it's energized and sense of joy and interest, then we examine the nature of our experience and we look at how things arise, how things are sustained, how things pass away. What are the causes and conditions sustaining this situation right now? And when we see the causes and conditions, then from there we can go, well, what causes and conditions are amenable to our efforts? In the case of an unfortunate or undesirable situation, which factors can we abandon? In the case of a desirable situation, how can we sustain those positive causes and conditions? Then, if we're going to expend effort, then what should be attended to first? What should be attended to afterwards? Because that choice is also highly significant and will affect the success that we have in dealing with the causal nexus of conditions. The Buddha says it's a teaching of kamma, it's a teaching of virya, teaching of wisdom, particularly here it's emphasizing vipajja, an analysis. So the calmer and the clearer, the more stable, the brighter your mind, the more easy it is to see things clearly and to make accurate analysis, to make wise decisions. So this is wonderful teachings that we have, and I could probably carry on talking for a lot longer, but I think I don't want to outstay my welcome because I'll be giving another talk tomorrow, and so I think that that will be sufficient for this evening.